Welcome to another episode of Code for Thought. In this episode, I'll be talking to Graham Lee from the University of Oxford in the UK and talk about his PhD thesis about research software engineering. But before we go into the interview, there's an important announcement I need to make. The Society for Research Software Engineering in the UK will be holding its annual conference in Swansea this year between the 5th and the 7th of September, and maybe you've seen this on the website already or received an email. Now, if you plan to submit a paper for a presentation or a poster session, you're in luck, because the conference committee has just extended the deadline for submissions to Wednesday, 3rd of May 2023. So, if you've been sweating it to get your abstract out, you'll have an extra week. It's probably unlikely there will be a further extension, so please don't miss out. Again, the call for submissions for the UK RSE conference is extended to the 3rd of May. The website and details can be found in the episode notes. All of which is actually a nice segue into my conversation with Graham, because Graham and I met at the previous RSE conference in Newcastle in 2022. Graham gave what's known as an inverted presentation, basically letting the audience drive what the presentation will talk about. The subject was to find out what and who RSEs are, which is of course the main subject of Graham's PhD thesis, and at least to my knowledge, the first PhD study to be conducted about RSEs, rather than working with RSEs. So who are we then? Well, let's turn to my conversation with Graham now. Hello, Graham, and welcome to the show, and thanks very much for your time. Before we start, can you introduce yourself quickly?
My name is Graham Lee. I am doing we call it a DPhil in Oxford because obviously Oxford has to be different, basically a PhD on research software engineering and RSEs and their work. For 3 years, I was a senior RSE in the Oxford RSE group as well.
I think that's quite interesting because I don't know how many people actually did a PhD on research software engineering specifically. Were you assigned a software engineering role, or was that about software engineering, the role that you had as an RSE in Oxford?
So I was recruited into Oxford to work as an RSE. The Oxford RSE group had been running for approximately a year with, I think, 2 people. And they were trying to grow this group and had some EPSRC funding to do work within the university. So I was hired on that basis. Before I'd worked at Oxford, I'd had a fairly long, about 15-year career as an industry software engineer. And I had completed an MSc in software engineering, also from Oxford. I had that sort of industry background and knowledge, which is what they were interested in sort of bringing into the group. And the doctorate sort of arose out of that, because if the thing I'm being asked to do is take all of your industry knowledge of software engineering and apply it in this context, I sort of naturally had the question, well, is that the right thing to do? Is this the knowledge that's needed? And as you say, this isn't an area that had actually been perhaps sort of systematically covered for research, and so it looked like a good opportunity to to give up on a social life for a few years.
As one does when one does a PhD.
Exactly.
Oh, it is quite interesting because it's almost like a meta thing about research software engineering, isn't it? And the reason we talk about this is because I met you at the Research Software Conference in Newcastle in 2022. And you gave a talk, well, not so much a talk as an interactive session on who is a research software engineer. So is that part of your thesis, actually, sort of trying to find out who we are?
Yeah, exactly. Because I think that there's an interesting question in there. If you look at the Society of Research Software Engineering, it sort of has like 2 parts to its mission statement. One is to improve the construction, development, whatever you want to call it, of software in research or used for research. And the other is to carve out a career pathway, a structure, some sort of stable employment model for research software engineers. Now, in order to do that second part, we have to understand, well, what are the careers? We know that it's actually a fairly broad, and I think deliberately fairly broad label that is kind of freely available for self-identification. If you are working in research and you do software, you are allowed to call yourself an RSE and align with this movement, join the society. But then there are also people who are employed on contracts for, say, research software engineer, or that have a job title with research software engineer, not all of whom are doing the same job as well. One of the common distinctions that's raised is between people who are in a sort of pool group where there's a research software engineering service in a university that researchers can come to work with or to get help or support. And then there's what's called the embedded research software engineer, who is much more akin to postdoctoral research assistant, whose focus in contributing to the research happens to be on the software related tasks. So there's already those two distinctions. There's already probably a continuum between those. Any particular individual may have bits of their job that look like one and bits of their job that look like another. So is there actually a thing that we can call either research software engineering, or a type of person, a sort of category of person working in research that we can call the research software engineer?
Then there is a third kind of role that I found when I talk to people, particularly in countries where the funding is a little bit thin on the ground when it comes to research software engineering as such, where people might identify as a research software engineer, but they pretty much fly under the radar. So they're actually officially researchers, or they have a fellowship on some kind of research subject. But I think in the UK, it's now gradually getting a little bit different now. Or what did your PhD find? Was that actually part of your remit, finding out what kind of roles we have in the UK?
The motivation for the work that led to this talk was actually trying to understand whether research software engineering exists as a profession that is distinct from some other role. For example, a postdoctoral researcher. So then we asked the question of are there any boundaries, and how fluid are they? Is there a point where you can say, right, if you're doing this work, then you are an RSE. But if you step over by one task towards writing research, maybe you contribute one more paragraph to a paper or something, it's not going to be that clear cut. But is there something that turns you into a researcher and means that you're not a research software engineer? And I'm looking at that through 4 characteristics which the research literature on the social sciences of professions identify as being the sort of hallmarks of a distinct profession, which are, it has a distinct body of knowledge, i.e. there are things that you would expect an RSE to know that you wouldn't expect a researcher to know, or you wouldn't expect an industry software engineer to know. That there is technical autonomy, i.e. RSEs get to choose how their work is done and what they do in order to fulfill their aims as an RSE. That there is a distinct sense of status or privilege associated with the role. The fourth of these properties, and this one's really hard to summarize because it's got a long-winded phrase, is a normative value of service to others or society. And what that means is that the profession, in this case RSE, has a collection of values that are shared, and an understanding of what the work does to benefit the people that they work with, and that has some sort of independence of the work that you're given by your supervisor, by your manager, by your client. So if you take a more established profession, law is an example of an ancient profession. You can see all 4 of these properties. You need to understand law before you're allowed to be a lawyer. And there are exams to make sure that you do. There is autonomy. You go to a lawyer and say, I want a divorce, or I want conveyancing done on my house. And then they go away and do that. They don't say, what documents would you like? What order would you like them in? They just do the work and then show you the results. They have a distinct status. There is some kind of idea of privilege associated with being a lawyer. Now, obviously, there's also views on sort of shady lawyers, but then that's where this fourth part, the normative value of service, comes in, because the law profession has an ethical code. It's actually quite strongly enforced because there is like a professional society and you have to be a member in order to practice, and you can be removed from that and therefore unable to practice, if you are found to be acting unethically.
We kind of meet some of the criteria, don't we? I had a discussion a while ago with somebody. Is RSE actually a discipline? Right? And we weren't really quite sure whether it is or not, because I think in the beginning you mentioned how distinct is it? It kind of is distinct from an academic career because it's not just about the research. It is about research as well. But how different is it, for instance, from software engineering in the industry? Is that really a difference? Do I need to have special skills as a research software engineer as opposed to somebody who works in an office, looks after a website, or creates code for an application?
And the answer to that is, and this is one of the interesting parts of the research I've done to date, is you will get different answers from different people. And so it's still fairly inconclusive. So let me just summarize my methodology quickly. We can get back if it becomes relevant. But basically, I interviewed a number of different people. I contacted them on the society Slack, then also emailed people who were in particular RSE groups. And so I got a range of responses from people who had literally landed into a role 2 or 3 days before they did the interview, people who are experienced RSEs, people who've managed RSE groups, and then some people who work with RSEs, like someone who works at a vendor on their interactions with research groups, and a journal editor for a data science journal that has a lot of research software content. So of those people, the ones who had experience in industry tended to say that the nuts and bolts of it, the software engineering, is basically the same. You're writing Python, and it doesn't matter whether you're writing Python for a company or for a university. You're using version control tools. Git doesn't change. Where things tend to differ are obviously the salaries came up quite a lot.
Yes, indeed.
And the sort of project management from a sort of software project management perspective, the workflows, the processes, the amount of checking in and refinement, the ability to state any idea of what the requirements are, either upfront or as you're going, differ in these two contexts.
As you would expect, because if you think about a product, then the requirements are slightly different to a research project, which is usually limited in its lifetime. Research project has funding maybe for 3 or 4 years, and maybe there will be something out of it that can then be used for other research projects, so it lives on a little bit. But in a product, you hopefully create something that lives on, that creates revenue and for years to come.
Yeah, so. And the outcome of the software product is a product. In research, the product may be answers to questions, maybe further questions. It's a lot harder to pin down when research is done, which means you typically just agree with your funding body how long you're going to go on for and what you expect to happen as a result of this. And then you report back on what actually did happen. So from my experience, and now this is sort of leaving the research findings aside and just reflecting on my experience in both, research software engineering has more similarity with early stage startup companies than it does with established companies. If you think about Microsoft Word, we know what we want from Microsoft Word. It's existed for 40 years now. It can get more stable, it can become easier to use, but you're adding things that customers want from a large base of customers. If you look at a seed startup, the product is almost irrelevant. What they're trying to do with their money is validate that they are asking the right question. Now, they are validating it in a marketplace. They're saying, can we find something that we can get customers for, and they're doing it by building prototypes, by doing user experience studies, essentially by doing some form of research and development. But the product doesn't come until later, when you've answered a load of those initial questions and sort of converged on something that your team, your investors, and your customers actually agree is the right question to be asking. Now, that is a lot more similar to what's going on in research, except that there are also RSEs who are working on like fairly large infrastructural projects.
But I think it's finding quite interesting that you try to compare that with startups from your perspective. But going back to the study, so how many people did you interview and how many people did you talk to for your PhD?
So it was a fairly small number because they were open-ended interviews, which means I was talking with people for about an hour, starting with questions like, which bits of your work do you get to choose how you do in order to explore this idea of autonomy? It was a dozen people in the initial round. Most of them either were employed as research software engineers or were considered themselves to be research software engineers, despite not actually having that title. And then a couple were managers or group leaders. So I think there were 4 of those. So you sort of like 50% actual people who are on the ground doing RSE, maybe then like 4 people who are leaders of people who do RSEs in one way or another, and then a couple of people who work with RSEs.
You mentioned somebody from a journal. So what made you choose somebody from a journal? I mean, journals obviously play an important part in science, as we know, because it's publish or perish. But why a journal in terms of research software engineering?
Because part of the question over the autonomy or the separate identity of the RSE role is how separated research software engineers are from the sort of motivating factors of being a researcher, from being evaluated as a researcher effectively. Like, it both came up in my research and like in informal discussions. I think even at the conference talk, I want to be doing the software, but I'm measured on how many papers I write. To some people, the ability to contribute to research is very interesting. One of my participants, and of course the data was collected anonymously, so I'm not going to identify who it was, but one of my participants described research software engineering as being a professional middle author. Now, that implies, that the role is connected to the production of and the publication of research output in journals. There's a bunch of interesting questions there from the perspective of the journal machinery itself, and thus the editor. Can you publish software without it being attached to a paper? What does that mean? Software is a sort of evolving thing. It isn't a tangible product, and you can always change the source code. So if you publish software, does that mean you've frozen it? If you haven't frozen it, then how does the publication event map onto the ongoing timeline of the software? And then also, like, even questions like what requirements can/should an editor put onto the software? Should they require that the source code is deposited in an archive? Can they require that any researcher can run exactly the same software and get the same results, which maps onto these ideas of FAIR, which is findability, accessibility, interoperability, and reproducibility. And if journal editors aren't currently making those requirements, but think it would be a good idea, then you have questions of why not? And what's the pathway to get there? And do research software engineers agree that those are good ideas and would like to get there? And do the researchers that they're working with agree and that it's a good idea? I'm sure we'll sort of come onto this question of why are we still talking about this 10 years after RSE was
indeed
was sort of coined as a term? You find that you have to move the entire system in order to make this change to fairly important but small part of the system. It's appropriate to ask who else is involved, what change are they trying to achieve, and how does that complement or conflict with the changes that we in the RSE community are trying to make?
From that point of view, it's quite important that you do include journals. And in fact, and as you quite rightly say, journals play such an important role in science, the recognition of science. But it's an interesting aspect, of course. What value does a paper that contains software, which probably won't be a paper, but maybe a link to a GitHub repo, really have in terms of publication? Because the moment you publish it, maybe the moment it already changed.
Right. And then, what does that mean for like the peer review process? Because presumably the peer reviewers, I was going to say, presumably the peer reviewers saw the version that existed at the time of submission, but maybe the thing was being changed even then. Do the peer reviewers in, well, even a data science journal, but let's say that you're a computational biologist now, or an RSE in a computational biology group, do the peer reviewers that are engaged by a biology journal have enough software engineering knowledge themselves to actually perform a valuable review to decide whether the software as part of the publication artifact contributes to the science or not?
What I want to discuss next is recognition. And that takes us back to the conference, because the conference actually had a number of sessions where it was asked, who are RSEs? That was your session, and I think yours was followed by somebody else who did a survey. And then the following day, I remember there was a whole workshop on who are RSEs. And I was wondering that it's quite odd because we've been at it for 10 years, at least in the UK we were, and we now have positions. So why are we still talking about this then?
Partly it comes down to this idea I mentioned before of having to bring the whole system around here. If you imagine that, any individual RSE has a lot of influence on the groups that they immediately work with, and some influence in the institutions and the academic community that they're based in, and then some tiny amount of influence on the entire edifice of the funding institutes and Universities UK and the management and all of the thing that's going on. So we've got this massive container ship, if you like, and we're trying to turn it around to point in a different direction. And we are hopefully doing that, because we think that it would be better. I think that probably most RSEs agree that better software will lead to better research. And also, hopefully, and this is perhaps the bit that's more relevant to my research, hopefully we all agree enough on what we mean by better and on which direction we think we should point the container ship that we're all trying to steer it in roughly the same direction, and that's going to lead to it changing. There isn't any CEO of research in the UK. You can't just get one person to believe in RSE and then they put out an edict that says we're going to do this. Part of the reason we're still here 10 years later is just the amount of time it takes. And part of it, I think, is that there is, I'm not saying that there definitely is a conflict here, but there is the potential for conflict. And this is one of the things that came up in the panel discussion. For people who weren't there, my session at the RSE conference was what I called an inverted panel. So I presented about 10 minutes of what we've been talking about, the findings from my research, and then just said, okay, now what do you think? This idea came up. What we're trying to do is to improve the software engineering capability in universities. What is sometimes happening, I don't know how frequently, but I get enough anecdotes about this that I think it's probably happening quite frequently, is that RSEs are seen as people you can outsource your software problems to.
Consultancies, basically.
Yeah, exactly. Another aspect of how I did this research was I invited all of my interview participants to group discussions, which were held under Chatham House rule, where you can report on what was said, but you can't report on who said it. To see a summary of the data that I've gathered and to then discuss that and to see whether what I had concluded from it made sense. One of these, there was this fairly heated discussion, took up a lot of the session, on whether the idea of service, the idea that RSEs are providing a service to researchers, implies servitude, and this idea that in what one person described as the snobbish academic culture in the UK, by which I think they mean the sort of hierarchical nature where you have the genius with the blackboard who then just has some minions to go do the work for them. Whether RSE is in danger of being seen as a minion and not as a peer collaborator who is providing intellectual input into the research. If what we're trying to do is to improve the way that software is done, what we're really trying to do is to sort of disseminate software engineering knowledge and understanding of the challenges and the solutions to those challenges throughout academia. But the natural thing to do is for someone to say, well, I don't understand this. You do understand this. Can you do this for me? And actually, on a sort of tactical basis, on a short-term project-to-project basis, some of us might enjoy that. If we're told, go into your cave and write the software and then tell me when it's done. And what we like doing is writing software, which is why we sort of gravitated towards these roles.
Indeed, yeah.
That might be quite appealing, but it might also fail to achieve the strategic goals. It may fail to disseminate this knowledge because we're actually just doing it ourselves.
Yeah, which brings me to the slogan of better software, better research, because then we need to talk a little bit about what we mean by better software. Better software written by people who actually are software developer experts, if you like, or better software across the board. And what does better mean in the first place?
Right. And that's a sort of challenge that I pose to some of my participants. If they say, well, we're trying to improve
Indeed, I remember that.
Or we're trying to make it better. I'm like, well, what do you mean by that? Often there's a sort of, I see this in industry as well, there's a sort of, I'll know it when I smell it definition of better. We have these sort of tacit models, especially when it comes to, I'm going to up my pretension points here and cite the book Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. Someone once told me, if you think you know what the book Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance was about, then you didn't know what the book was about. It has these ideas of quality in it, external quality and internal quality. There's a section in the book where there are two motorcyclists, and one of them has a really shiny bike that's a work of art, like a sculpture, and they really like sort of keeping it clean and riding this bike. And the other person has a bike that's fairly beat up, but that they know how everything works, and if something breaks on it, they can take a bit of it apart, fix it, put it back on, and carry on going. These are the external quality of what you see and perceive of the artifact as a whole, and then the internal quality, what you understand of the workings and the inner parts. And you can apply that to software as well.
Indeed, exactly. In fact, you can apply that to research software engineering. You have the people who go to the garage, so the researchers are saying, give me some software, and then you have the people who understand what they're doing and write the software themselves.
Yeah. So is better software better because it's easier to work on, or better because it provides a better experience for the people who are using it? Or is it both? How do you trade off working on one versus the other? From the internal quality perspective, we could look at something like maintainability. And that is something that is important to internal software quality in industry, is have I developed this thing such that when my marketing director comes and says 55% of our customers want this new feature, can we add it in a reasonable amount of time? Now, in research software, we've already talked about the fact that there is some infrastructural software where we'd want to be able to do that. If everybody needs a new feature in Pandas, we'd better be able to add that feature to Pandas. On the other hand, research software also involves a load of scripts that are written once, decide whether some data coming from an experiment is worth further investigation, or generate figure 3 in a paper. That software doesn't necessarily need to be maintainable because nobody's ever going to touch it again. Except that if you treat it as if it's never going to be touched again, you can guarantee that it will actually be used by somebody else.
The worst case scenario always happens.
Yeah. So yes. It means that this question of what is better software or what is quality software is situational. Like I say, I think that many people have tacit understandings of what they mean when they say better software or quality software. But I don't think that there is necessarily a shared framework for research software in this context needs to be treated this way, or research software that is going to be part of infrastructure needs to have this set of sort of quality standards apply.
Well, it reminds me of an interview I had with Derek Jones, who wrote a blog post called Is research software engineering a tangled mess? Which basically touched on exactly the same point, that a number of people are writing software, because they need something for the research project with no view on maintainability and sustainability and all the other aspects that you're looking for when you're designing and developing a product. So over to you. Do you think that research software is a tangled mess?
I think it definitely is. Like, whether or not we are untangling it is the interesting question. I mean, I remember reading Derek's post. I think he was fairly pessimistic. But then you can find other people, like Ben Goldacre has recently written a report where he talks up the importance of research software engineers and the contributions they make. You can find like optimistic takes as well. I mean, I would say that this is not a problem that is unique to research software, and that commercial software is also a tangled mess. Let's go back to that example of like the seed startup company. They're going to try some prototypes, mock up some UIs, try and work out where what they call the product market fit is, i.e. where the thing that they want to build and the thing that customers want overlap. And then they find that, and they're going to build a product. Now, a disciplined way to ensure quality at this point is to say, okay, well, the prototype was a useful learning experience. Now we need to build something that customers will actually use. So let's just take that knowledge and start again and build a thing that is designed to be used by customers and extended into the future and to have a life.
Which, of course, doesn't happen.
Exactly. It doesn't happen. What we do instead is go, okay, well, customers will buy this thing tomorrow. Can you put the prototype onto a website somewhere and start selling it? And then we're in the same boat that the RSEs are in, that they wrote a script to like support the writing of one paper, and then 5 years later, someone else is still trying to use it. I'm fairly optimistic that like we are working in the same direction. There is actually a lot of maybe implicit consensus, but consensus nonetheless that what we need to do is to improve the training availabilities to researchers in general about how software works. And there is coalescence around particular ideas like Fair for Research software, like reproducible research, and then reproducible software environments. That is going to lead to generally a raising of the water for research across the board, because like these things are going to disseminate out. They're definitely happening at different rates in different research disciplines
and countries.
Yes, different countries. As you said, the UK was out in front in sort of definition of RSE, and it's not yet happening everywhere else. And also, it isn't happening very quickly. And so, like someone who's just going, right, what is the state of software in 2022 or whenever Derek wrote that post? Yes, I still see these problems. That's an interesting point itself. Is the end game for RSE that there are no RSEs because the research community is now capable of doing software for itself? Or is it that there is some sort of stable state where there are a number of RSEs and a better standard of software in research? I'm going to leave that one for the comments section, I think, not just
Yeah, well, in actual fact, that's a nice segue into the final question, which is there ever going to be a established RSE roles? Is it ever going to be an untangled mess? And is that even a desirable state to be in? There's obviously need for software in research. You need to have people who are able to write software, but maybe the state can change and everybody will be able to write software. Going back to this motorcycle example you gave.
I think it's easier to say that I would like to see an explicit and shared understanding of what it means to make software better, so that we can all understand whether we are working towards that or not. And in 10 years, I would like to see that being expressed. And I don't think that that's actually that far away. I think that the Society for Research Software Engineering are working on that. I think the Software Sustainability Institute are working on that. I think there are various working groups in various research disciplines who are all trying to identify that. And so some kind of manifesto or convention on software in research is maybe only 2 years away, which means that there's then 8 years of, I've got 8 years of spare time. Now, what happens in that? I would say well, it's all about adopting and internalizing those values in research communities. The RSE community as it exists now will play an important role in that because we're the people who understand how software works, how software engineering works, how to run software projects. So we've got a head start. But I also think training, and not training for new RSEs, training for new researchers, PhD programs, master's programs, looking at making software as much a part of the next generation of researchers' skills as writing a paper is. There are various scientific disciplines, and actually I'm going to definitely attribute this quote to my supervisor, David Gavigan, because I know that he's said that. There are scientific disciplines where using a lab book is absolutely non-negotiable. It is part of the protocol. Software is essentially an online form of lab book. It is a method. It should be as non-negotiable as the lab book is.
In addition to teaching people to write lab books, which is what we do in courses, if you do a practical in biology or in physics even, we also need to teach them software.
Yes.
Or basic principles of that.
Yes. Not every researcher is going to need to use software every day, but then even when they're communicating with, like, let's say there are still RSEs in 10 years' time, you still need to understand enough about how the process works in order to be an effective client.
So I would like to close with a question about your PhD. So how far away are you from finishing it?
Oh dear, that's the question you never ask a PhD student, isn't it?
When can you get your social life back, Graham?
So I'm working with three very good supervisors. David Gavigan, I've already mentioned, Helena Webb at Nottingham University, and Susanna Assunta Sansone, who's in the Oxford E-Research Centre in Engineering Science. They've all been incredibly helpful and got me to the point where I am now. I've been doing this for 2 years around a job as a full-time RSE or software engineer. I would expect to have another 2 years at least.
Well, thank you so much for your time, Graham. I wish you all the best for the future and for your thesis.
Thank you very much, Peter. This has been a great conversation. Thanks for having me on.
If you want to find out more about the wondrous world of research software engineering and want to meet like-minded people, or indeed join the community, why not meet us at our conferences? As I mentioned at the beginning, the UK will hold its annual meeting in Swansea between 5th and 7th of September. The RSE community in the US will have the very first in-person and hybrid conference in Chicago between the 16th and the 18th of October. And if you happen to be in Germany and available at the end of September, there will be an unconference in the city of Jena between the 26th and the 28th of September. Oh, time's up. See you next time. But before I forget, this podcast is covered by the Creative Commons license. See ya!